Finally, I'd like to begin by introducing our speakers, and I'd like to begin by introducing Mr. Four. Mr. Four offers refreshing takes on some of our most pressing topics, covering everything from politics to technology, immigration to economics, liberalism to sports, with his trademark perception and candor. A former fellow at the New American Foundation, Mr. Four served as editor for the New Republic for 7 years. He became a national correspondent for The Atlantic in December 2016. To my other side, we have Mr. Thierer. He will be representing the negative side of tonight's question. And Mr. Adam Thierer is a senior research fellow with the Technology Policy Program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He specializes in technology, media, internet, free speech policies with a particular focus on online safety and digital privacy. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Washington Post, and The Atlantic, and Forbes. He has appeared on national television and radio. Mr. Thierer is a frequent guest lecturer and has testified numerous times on Capitol Hill. And finally tonight, I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Galuza, who is the Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of Government at Patrick Henry College. He also serves as the college's pre-law advisor and coaches the college's mock trial and moot court teams. The moot court team has won 9 consecutive national championships. He is the author of Over the Wall, Protecting Religious Expression in the Public Square, and co-editor of the book Before the Paper Chase, The Scholarship of Law, Law School Preparation, and Admissions. Dr. Galuza holds a PhD in Government and International Studies from the University of Notre Dame, a Master's in Political Science from the University of Wyoming, a Master's in Divinity from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Wyoming. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Galuza. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure tonight. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? To be moderating this debate and representing the Millennium Society on campus. The debate we're going to have tonight is an interesting format in that there's a series of speeches that the two debaters are going to give, and then a series of questions from me, from each other, and then largely from you. So when Mr. Cochran said, would you please fill out those cards, we really mean it. I mean, there's a large part of the debate format that's structured around your questions. So we'll either go to the microphone and hear you directly, or I'll be glad to read your question if you want to turn it in tonight. We're going to do a couple procedural things. If these guys run out of time, apparently this clock flashes at them, but I know I would ignore it, and so I don't know whether they will too. And so I'll try to be gracious and give a few seconds, and after that I'll start to clap, and if you'd clap too, that should be an indication that we're probably done hearing them, at least on that particular question. Okay, what we're going to do is begin with opening statements from both sides. I'm going to ask Mr. Four if he'd give his opening statement for five minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I wanted to begin by asking everyone in this room a personal question, which is, how many of you sleep with your phones? All right. I think those of you who are not raising your hands are probably lying. This is a very, very common phenomenon. That you stick your phone by the side of your bed because we know that our phones are essentially appendages of our bodies right now. That when my phone is in another room, it feels as if my arm has been severed. And when I go to bed, I have to keep my phone in the basement because I know that if I were to wake up in the middle of the night and my phone was by my bedside table, I would go there and I would get stuck in some sort of endless scroll, and I'd wake up the next morning and I would have no idea what I'd looked at in the morning, but it would have disrupted my circadian rhythms. And the point that I think that we all know deep down is that we're addicted to our technology. And that addiction is not accidental. Our phones, our platforms, Facebook, Google, these are inventions that have been reverse engineered in order to addict us. That when these companies are in a war right now to get as much of our attention as possible. And so they send us notifications constantly. They array their content in such a way that's intended to make us stay as engaged as long as possible on their sites. And so really what's happening right now to us is akin to what we've seen happen in food, the ways in which we've seen this with so much of fast food and so much. The reason that we have a childhood obesity crisis in this country right now is because foods were shoved full of salt and sugar and lipids in such a way that it becomes hard to addict them. And maybe we've woken up many decades later and realized that that those foods took a terrible toll on our waistlines and our way of life. But my concern is that the same thing will happen to us mentally because of the addictions that we're having now, and because of the ways in which we are being engineered. We are lab rats in an experiment that is being conducted on us by these big companies. And I come to you. I'm a Jew, and I do not share probably the politics of some of the people in this room, but I do think I want to pose a challenge to you as Christians, because I think that you have a special obligation, because the questions that we're dealing with are in some ways economic, because these companies have developed such a dominance in the way that they shape markets. What floats to Google is the thing that's a winner. They play a dominant role in news because Facebook plays such an important role in shaping the way that we consume news. But I think what we're talking about in a lot of ways is our relationship to machines. Because, look, as human beings, we've always had technology. Technology defines us in some ways as a human being. And we've merged with our machines in ways that are great. We have factories that automated upper body strength. Hammers is an extension of the human body that allows us to do magnificent things. But we're merging with a different sort of machine right now because these are intellectual technologies. Sergey Brin, who is the co-founder of Google, talks about the day in which Google will be implanted in our brain. And when we merge with these machines, we're not just merging with technology, we're merging with the companies that operate and run those technologies. And I think as Christians, you understand the importance. As a Jew, I think as spiritual beings, we understand the importance of preserving spaces in our life where we preserve the integrity of the human being, where we preserve the spaces where we can contemplate the world, where we're disconnected, where we're able to maintain our independence as thinkers, and the questions at stake go so much beyond economics, what's efficient, to really the core questions of what makes us human and how we can preserve it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Four. I thought Mr. Cochran gave the resolution or the question, just in case he didn't. The question is competition, free speech and privacy threatened by the rising dominance of tech giants, and if so, should government intervene? And with this opening statement, Mr. Thier.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to join Franklin here on stage and discuss his book and the proposition before us tonight, which I will most definitely be answering no to. In doing so, I'm going to address some of the arguments that Franklin's made in his book, and Franklin and I have debated these issues before and discussed some of the themes. And some of the themes that I think are interesting in his book, I find more interesting more generally because as a student of the philosophy of technology, I've spent a lifetime studying media criticism and the thinking in different disciplines about communications and media throughout the ages. And if there's any one conclusion I've drawn from my 25 years of covering these issues, it's that there's really nothing new under the sun, that the more things change, the more things really stay the same. And I could go all the way back to the time of really Plato and Aristotle and find the same sort of criticisms about media that we hear in Franklin's book and those of leading critics today echoed back in the writings of, say, Plato and the Phaedrus and many other writings since then. What are those criticisms? Well, I mean, they're things that we hear in Franklin's book and other books about, first, the supposed death of the arts and high culture and of journalism and good media. And there's secondly the idea that we have a rising class of isolated, distracted, or addicted individuals, especially kids. And then third, the idea that there's the growth of sort of an unstoppable force of media titans or large tech conglomerates that are taking over our brains and sort of like leading us like mindless sheep to the cyber slaughter. These are the sort of arguments that you can go back and find in almost any leading text of media and technological criticism in any given age. You just have to erase the names and the companies or the villains and substitute in the latest villain du jour. What's most frankly interesting about Franklin's book to me is how the cast of characters in it, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, would not have been in this book 10, 15 years ago. It would have been a cast of characters like Microsoft and Bill Gates, or MySpace and Rupert Murdoch, or AOL Time Warner and Steve Case, or BlackBerry or Motorola. That would have just been, say, 15 years ago. Those were the leading tech titans of the day that we were worried about. And then a generation before that, we worried about large media conglomerates, television and radio operators, ABC, NBC, CBS, the big three as it was called. And before that, it was large newspapers. What are we going to do about these large local newspapers and how they're taking over our minds and programming our thoughts? And you could go back again and again and again and find this all the way back to the printing press, and again, all the way back to the time of Plato, who famously argued in the Phaedrus, as I alluded to, the idea that when the god Thuth and the king Famous were arguing about whether or not humans should be given the written word, the complaint was, if we give humans the written word, how will they remember the folk tales that they memorize and tell around the campfire? My gosh, we should be careful about giving them the written word. And, we rang our hands about the written word, then we rang our hands about the printing press, and then about broadcast television, and then newspapers, and so on and so forth, all the way down now to the internet, social media, search engines, and other types of technologies. So in thinking about the future, this is not to say that we should not be concerned about the power of certain companies or certain sectors or certain social trends. We absolutely should be. But we have to think also about measured responses. We have to think about what types of approaches we want to take to correcting for maybe an overabundance of information or news or something like that, or the fact that our devices are so addictive. And on that point, I'll just close my opening 5 minutes by pointing out that one of the interesting criticisms of a lot of modern critics, like Franklin, is this problem of addiction and excessive media exposure, information overload, if you will, or information addiction, as he calls it. Well, some of you aren't maybe old enough to remember a different time. The time when I was growing up, I was born before humans set foot on the moon. I'm a pretty old codger. We had a different world. We had a different world where we only had a handful of media operators or platforms or different types of informational inputs. We had a local newspaper, if you were lucky, maybe not. We had, if you were lucky, a couple of crummy television stations. If you were in deep rural Illinois or Indiana like me, you had to get them from far away, and sometimes, certain times of the days, you didn't get them in. I used to have to stand next to a television antenna, hold it with one hand, and put my other arm out for my dad to watch sport games from Chicago. That was the age I lived in the 70s. We did have a library. It sucked. We didn't have any other way to access outside information. My best friend growing up was a 24-volume set of World Book encyclopedias, which I read backward, forward, and everywhere in between. That was a world of information scarcity, a world of information poverty, if you will. And I just want you all to remember that the world we live in today, despite its problems, despite its controversies, and we will certainly discuss some tonight, I may even find myself agreeing with Franklin about many of them, it is still, I would argue, a better world than the world that we just came out of information poverty.
Okay, we're going to continue the speech portion of this debate by allowing each of them to have a rebuttal or a response. So Mr. Four, if you'd go ahead and take 3 minutes and respond to Mr. Thier.
I agree with almost everything that he said, that we live in an incredible world filled with all sorts of opportunities. The technologies that have been invented have improved the world, and that in some ways we're on a path of progress. But I think it's important that we consider our relationship to these technologies, because we're standing on the knife's edge right now. We're on the cusp. That as these companies amass power over markets, over the public sphere, over our lives, we have to make important choices as a species about how we want to relate to these technologies. And so one of the choices, these companies are in the business of surveillance. They watch you constantly. They know everything that you've entered into Google. They know that everything that you've liked on Facebook. They track where you go. And we may choose to accept that to a certain extent because we like the quality of the products that they offer. But these companies are in an arms race with one another, that their comparative advantage rests on their surveillance of you. And so it's their incentive to keep pushing the boundaries of surveillance, to keep engineering more invasive techniques to track you. And so they develop facial recognition software, and they listen to your conversations. And I know I'm sounding paranoid in describing this to you, but this is just the world that we live in. And so we need to make a choice about how much we want to invite these companies into our world. That is going to ultimately be a choice that governments and politicians are going to have to make about whether we want to set any sort of rules and limits. Right now, there are no limits. There are no rules. We live in an ungoverned universe. There is the question of whether we want to maintain a world of robust economic competition, because we see markets getting ever more concentrated. And this is going to have consequences for our communities, that you live in places where the malls get shut down, where main streets get eviscerated. And as a result, our lives are less enriched because we don't have the social interactions that come with meeting people at stores and interacting with people who are not like us when we have to leave our houses. And we're moving to a world where Amazon is just going to be the dominant player. And maybe somebody will come and knock Amazon down. But historically, the American way of capitalism has been to maintain as a robust state of competition as possible.
Mr. Thier, you have 4 minutes.
Sure. So in terms of what choices we have, or how much we should be concerned about some of these concerns about how to, as Franklin says, how to potentially limit the reach of some of these companies, or whether or not we should invite them into our lives. I think that's a fair question. I think that's a question we always ask about each and every new technology that comes into our life. There's certainly a case to be made that certain types of technologies, we can go over the top with them. We can spend too much time with them. And I certainly take my cell phone to bed at nights and it sits right next to me, but I also have certain rules that I integrate into my life. Screens off after a certain period of time for both myself and for my children. And for limiting media in other ways. There are ideas such as digital sabbaticals about taking time outs during your day, during your week, during the month, to just get away from certain types of platforms or electronic media. There are ways we can utilize so-called media literacy or digital literacy to try to address how to teach young people how to better explore or understand media around them so that they become good consumers of media and technology as they grow older. And then there are, of course, additional choices, different options. The best news we have today is that you don't just have a handful of platforms. There's a lot, for all the talk of tech titans, there are actually far more choices that you have to exercise today than ever before in terms of how you consume your media. There's, again, a lot of huffing and puffing about Facebook and how important it is. I mean, all I need to do is talk to my teenage kids on a weekly night and say, what do you think of Facebook? And they both howl out in laughter. Facebook, that's for old people. That's just something I'm like a little bit confused about, but it's the reality of their existence. They have other platforms. And that goes for a lot of other technologies and services. As I pointed out a moment ago, we have all sorts of players that we don't hear Franklin worried about that a generation ago we did. What happened to them? Well, the Schupeterian waves of creative destruction blew into town and decimated them. It made their lives miserable and made it so that we now consider some of them a laughingstock joke. If you see anybody carrying a BlackBerry, you'll laugh out loud, right? 10 years ago, it was the hot device to have. If you're still thinking Microsoft's the most cutting-edge tech company in town, you're also probably going to be laughed out of the room, and so on and so forth. And so when you hear these ideas that, like, this is the end, we've reached the final stage of media greatness or whatever, or media a horrible nature, you know, the reality is that I have a little bit more faith in the power of creative destruction and of technological change to come in and change these things. But I think when we think about what we want to do about these things, I think this is the question we'll probably get to next. There is a really legitimate concern that when we're talking about media and communications platforms and technologies, that we do not do violence to the First Amendment or our free speech traditions in thinking about how to regulate what are, after all, technologies of communications and technologies of freedom. Because these are the kind of decisions that sometimes when government engages in them to try to make life better, they actually make life much worse.
Okay. This is the part that I'm most concerned about because I have to ask some questions here, and I'm clearly a neophyte on these topics. So let me ask Mr. Thier, and I'll ask them sequentially. Mr. Foer is raising the issue about potentially losing the malls and losing mom and pop's ice cream store. I don't know if I'm so terribly concerned about losing those, but his argument about us being lab rats for the company, and maybe suggesting really the company are the rats, okay, is one that you addressed slightly in the response. I'd like you to press on a little bit further. I mean, the idea that information that I have is so sophisticated that I'll get songs, I'll get ads, I'll get all sorts of things that are recommended for me based upon somebody synthesizing that information. Or, as Mr. Foer's talking about, the very serious question about Google being planted in the arm or in the head or something like that. What's your response to that? Is that just an empty threat, or is it something that we have to be reasonably vigilant about?
Well, I don't want to dismiss it entirely, but when Franklin says in his book that we need to rally around the flag of, quote, rejecting the primacy of convenience and low prices, end quote, I would say, you know, I'm a big fan of convenience and low prices, and that would include the convenience of having personalized choices provided to me. This is, again, a great benefit that we have somehow turned into a great curse. But the reality is that for those of us who cut our teeth in the field of regulatory law and economics, we were taught that there are three variables that really make a difference to consumer welfare traditionally. That's price, quality, and quantity. And in the past, we adjusted all of our regulatory policies accordingly, trying to boost consumer welfare by getting lower prices, higher quality, more choices. That was a pretty good goal for public policy, I would argue. I don't believe that our regulations necessarily always got us there, but that was a pretty smart goal. Well, today we've got it in spades. We've got lower prices than ever before. Most of these services we're talking about are free or very cheap. That's a good price. We've got better quality than ever before. We've got more quality content than we can ever imagine in terms of traditional media like television and music. We talk about the golden age of these things. And then we think about quantity, of course, more abundance than we can possibly choose from on a given day. So you think about these things and you say, okay, well, wait a minute. They can't all be really free, right? There must be a cost. And indeed there is. There is indeed a cost. And that cost is that sometimes we can be overwhelmed with these choices, or we can have our privacy overwhelmed by them. Because the reality is that a site like Facebook, just to name one, but there are many others, are basically digital nudist colonies. You go in there expecting to basically bare your soul to the world and share all your information, or else you probably wouldn't be there. You can talk a big game about privacy, but if you're on a site like that, you're there because it's about hyper-sharing. It's about sharing with the world what you think or what you want them to know about and getting more information back. So, and to some extent, it's a little bit of caveat emptor has to apply, right? Buyer beware of what you're getting into. That doesn't mean we should give away all our privacy or that we should just throw anything online. But the reality is that we understand that there are trade-offs and that there are benefits from sharing that information with Facebook, with Google, with Apple, with Amazon, because the resulting convenience, not just in terms of personalization and lower prices, but in terms of just the world of options and outputs that are at our disposal, are something that we have to consider when we think about whether or not we want to regulate that.
Mr. Foer, you have a minute response, and you have a few seconds over.
Okay. Buyer beware. So let's take this analogy to aviation. So we have this great new technology, airplanes. We're just going to let them fly, right? And so, but no, we don't. We set rules. We have air traffic control. We have standards. We have safety standards. We protect passengers who get on airplanes. It's not crazy to think that we should have standards and rules for the internet when it comes to the surveillance of us. And I feel like that's the question that he has a hard time answering. He's saying if you enter into the internet, then you should expect to surrender your privacy. And I say, no, we need to have some protections. As human beings, as a society, we need to make decisions to protect ourselves in this world, to be safe. And we need to protect kids who enter in this world, who are subjected to, all the horrors of the internet and who don't necessarily have the conscious ability to make the choices that you might be able to make. And so, to me, this question of setting reasonable limits, and we're not saying let's destroy capitalism. I'm not saying let's destroy technology and go back to a pre-internet time. The internet's awesome. We should be able to keep it. We should be able to enjoy its fruits. But let's make it like the roads, like the air, like agriculture, like every other part of human society, where we say, okay, let's just set a few reasonable rules of the road.
Okay, Mr. Ford, the question I would ask you is, I looked it up in about 10 years ago, and you probably have this data in your own writings. The leading companies were companies like Exxon and others. Now they're Amazon and Google and Facebook and a couple of other high-tech companies.
Yeah.
In fact, the top 5. Why wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that within 10 years there'll be something else? And let me finish. I'm not sure that, apart from the answer that you just gave in response, I mean, just in economic terms, should we move too soon to tax, to break up, apply other antitrust remedies, that we run the risk of kind of circumscribing
Right.
this economic innovation?
Well, part of it is that they should just obey the same rules that Exxon and Microsoft and Walmart obey, which is that these companies have offshored a lot of their intellectual property to Ireland and Europe and the like, and they don't pay tax to the United States of America. Donald Trump made that argument in the campaign, and these companies, I think, have been eschewing their patriotic duty by not paying the same tax as their competitors, and that a lot of some of their advantage has been built on the avoidance of taxation. But this ultimate question, whether we can simply just let the course of capitalism work its magic and assume that things are going to shift. Well, I'd say that there are two things. One is, I don't know. I can't answer. I can't predict into the future. But what I see is that they've built this comparative advantage on the basis of the data that they've created and the networks that they've created, which could potentially someday be taken down. But we deal with the reality that we face now, and we try to make the best choices that we can with the economic reality that we see in front of us. And I'm not saying that we do anything crazy, but the United States government did file an antitrust suit against Microsoft, and the net result of that lawsuit was Google. That Microsoft had used its dominance in the browser to prevent competition, and when the government filed its case against Microsoft, Microsoft suddenly started to behave with greater restraint. They didn't use their advantage over Google to strangle Google in the crib. And as a result of the government making a fairly prudent decision, we were able to spur innovation in our society.
Mr. Thayer, it would seem to me that if you break up, or if you allow monopolies to be monopolies, innovation would be enhanced. But I did a quick look at what happened with telephone company, and my understanding was that the telephone company received kind of a deal in the 50s with the United States that they could operate as a monopoly, almost a utility, but a monopoly, but any of the innovation would be shared with the American people, and not through being charged, but actually would be part of the American public domain. And what ended up happening was innovation ended up being enhanced, and even after AT&T was broken up, Bell Laboratories had like 8 Nobel Prize winners, and the innovation continued. And so are the reasonable steps that Mr. Ford is calling for something that would also enhance innovation?
Well, it's a lot to unpack in 1 minute here because I've written
We get two.
I've written a history of called Unnatural Monopoly, a history of monopolization in the telecommunications sector, where I go back and document all these things back to the 1870s about what really did cause monopoly and how we then addressed it. And I can't retell that whole story tonight, but I can encourage you to read it. But the bottom line is that what did we do when we were concerned about monopoly in that and other sectors throughout the past century? Well, usually it was a combination of some sort of, as you said, public utility style regulation, married up with some so-called amorphous public interest obligations or fiduciary type standards, which included things like licensing broadcast spectrum or licensing new cable systems or whatever else. We have a full century of history and experience with those regulatory models. They were an unambiguous disaster for consumers. We did not gain more choices. We did not gain more innovation. We did not keep pace with what we could have done if we would have actually tried to take steps to encourage serious types of facilities-based innovations and new competition to traditional entrenched monopolies that were often put there, as AT&T was, thanks to a lot of government deal-making. So when we think about other new sectors like Facebook, Google, Apple, so on and so forth, we should be very, very cautious about whether or not we want to intervene and in the name of serving consumer welfare, do something that actually instead harms it. Because the reality is that there already are many existing government ways to address concerns that Franklin's raised. There hasn't been much mention, and I don't see much in his book, about how we already have things like Unfair and Deceptive Practices Authority at the federal level through the Federal Trade Commission or at the state level through AGs and consumer protection offices. And most tech companies have already had to deal with these agencies. We don't hear a lot about how we might be able to utilize less restrictive means of agencies using so-called soft law or multi-stakeholder processes to maybe work with companies or trade associations to try to address concerns that arise in a more softer kind of collaborative way as opposed to a heavy-handed top-down kind of way. And then, yes, still, antitrust exists. It hasn't gone away. We have had lawsuits not only against Microsoft, but also we've had one during the Obama administration against Google and many others considered. There's a major case going on right now with AT&T and Time Warner. So these things continue, and the courts evaluate and see whether or not there's any merit to them. The question is, do we need anything more than that? Do we need to bring in a giant regulatory wrecking ball and start destroying the information economy, which I will just say in closing is different from things like airlines or nuclear facilities or weapons or anything else, because it's about information. This is not about dangerous goods that are physically going to have irreversible types of catastrophic harm. That's just not the kind of same thing. We do not engage in preemptive prophylactic regulation of information sectors because we care about free speech in the First Amendment and we understand that the harm is not the same as something like Franklin was talking about.
Mr. Ford, do you have a response?
I think Patrick Henry students know the value of information and the importance of information and the quality of information to shaping a democracy. And our founders understood it too. And the history of communications is one in which there's a very strong American way in which we try to limit concentrations of power. We're skeptical of concentrations of power. So first monopoly in communications was the post office. Government said, you know what? We're not going to let you extend that monopoly into the telegraph business. Western Union gets a monopoly in the telegraph business, and you know what? The U.S. government says we're not going to let you extend that monopoly into the telephone business. AT&T gets a monopoly in the telephone business, and the government says we're not going to let you take that into the radio business. We get a couple networks, and the government says, you know what? NBC, you're too powerful, you're going to have to become NBC and ABC. The Nixon administration says, you know what, we don't like this, we're going to encourage competition, so it helps facilitate the creation of the cable news business. So on and so forth down the line. Thomas Jefferson wanted to write monopoly into the Constitution as a fundamental concern because our founders cared about concentrations of power in all of its forms. They cared about concentrations of power in the public sphere. They cared about concentrations of power in the private sphere. Go and read the founding manifesto for the National Review, and you'll see there's a paragraph there devoted to the problem of monopoly. This is not a liberal question. This is not a conservative question. This is a core American question.
Okay, Mr. Ford, last question to you. You've raised some philosophical issues and some concerns, theological issues to be concerned. Let me end this more on an economic issue, and I'm speculating, so I mean, there may be others who can answer these questions. We'll raise them during the Q&A. What's going on internationally, okay? And is it possible that the international community may impact to break up these monopolies, and or, let me flip it around, that these monopolies may end up being an important safeguard for us when it comes to the cyber defense?
When I read about Facebook and Google doing business in China, I get afraid because I see that there's an authoritarian government in China and that to do business in parts of the world where there are regimes that don't share our values, they seem to me to make compromises to happily accede to the values of those regimes. And I worry about the compromises, about how those values and how that business plan could ricochet here. I mean, I think that there's a very real possibility that these companies ultimately make a truce with government, where they say, you know what, we're going to accept being a regulated monopoly. If you tell us to do certain things, you know, and it starts with very harmless things that we could all agree with about regulating sex trafficking on the, like, I want these companies to take responsibility for sex trafficking on their platforms. Then we'll say, you know what, take responsibility for foreign ads that appear on your sites. And then we say, take responsibility for fake news. And I do worry that because we're dealing with the realm of information, that these companies do represent something different. They do need to be handled differently. And the threats that the concentrations of power in this realm pose are unique. And you know, things are about to change very dramatically because the Europeans are ushering in a new privacy regime this year. And, you know, it could have a salutary impact on these companies because for the first time, they're going to be asked to be transparent and to be accountable for their surveillance. And I think that there's actually a lot that we need to learn from that example. And that I think it's important to have a values-based approach to dealing with these problems.
Mr. Thier, response?
Okay, so there's been a lot said since last time spoke. First of all, there was, as we call it in the field of rhetoric, an appeal to history or appeal to authority when we heard Franklin talk about what the founders had to say about aggregations of power. Indeed, let's talk about the founders. They were very, very concerned about aggregations of power, so much so that they wrote a constitution with the most serious constraints on government that had ever been penned. And they began the Bill of Rights by saying, Congress shall make no law. And that was a very clear signal, I believe, and an unambiguous one, that the greatest and most concerning monopoly of all is the monopoly over force that our government possesses. And this is something we have to understand is qualitatively different than when we're talking about private commercial operators and their relative market power, which I will not deny that these companies won't be large and have reach and have influence in our society or culture. That would be idiocy to say such a thing. But it would also be idiocy to suggest that it is somehow equal with the awesome power of government to constrain and restrict. Secondly, on the Europe point, if I do have time, I guess I don't. Very briefly, I mean, let's think about Europe. I mean, what did Europe do when they started imposing very heavy-handed data directives and privacy regulations throughout the 1990s? Well, I'll tell you what they did. They decimated their technology and telecommunications sector. Try to name a single major information technology operator based in Europe today. Can anyone? I suppose Spotify might be fair game, but that's about it. Every other one is here. It's here because nobody would want to do business in Europe. Now you could say that's fine because we don't want companies like these tech companies doing business there. Well, that's funny because a whole hell of a lot of European consumers love those American tech companies. And so we ought to really think hard about whether we want to engage in cheerleading for the Europeans in an effort to decimate whatever the next generation of technology is that comes along, such as the Internet of Things or robotics or autonomous systems or whatever else, with sort of heavy-handed top-down directives from Brussels.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to go into kind of the political structure here. I'm going to ask, first of all, Mr. Cochran, do you have those cards?
Yes, sir. We're going to collect them. So all of you, if you wouldn't mind giving me cards, if you have any questions, please just write your question down and pass them to the center. For here, pass them to the center aisle, and I'll collect them. Back here, just pass them to the side, and we'll collect them.
Let's collect them now if we can, so we don't have a gap. Okay, I'm going to ask Mr. Four to ask a question to Mr. Thayer. What we'll do is have Mr. Thayer have 2 minutes to respond. Mr. Four then can have a 1 minute response, and then we'll do the same where Mr. Thayer asks a question of Mr. Four. Okay, so Mr. Four, your question for Mr. Thayer.
Does government have any role, in your view, in protecting our privacy from these companies?
Sure. So we already have privacy policies on the books for many different types of segments or sectors of our economy. We have it for healthcare, we have it for children's privacy, and we have it for financial services, for example. These are targeted privacy laws that we thought needed to be addressed, needed to be added to the books after there were some very specific harms identified in those narrow contexts. We could bicker about whether or not those policies have been effective or they should be expanded. But we've also done that in, I think, a wise way in the sense that we've not established an overarching top-down sort of European-style privacy regime for the United States. Because of all the reasons I already addressed, you don't want to stifle the flow of information in a world where you can have serendipitous data discovery leading to really interesting, exciting, life-altering and life-enriching innovations. That's why privacy needs to be limited in a regulatory scope, but then also addressed better in a court where we have privacy torts and other types of policies such as intrusions upon seclusion and trespass and other types of things can address very targeted narrow privacy harms as they develop in conjunction with, finally, unfair and deceptive practices and antitrust laws. So those are at least 5 or 6 government policies I've named.
So we should rest on the courts when we have devices in our homes that are listened to us all the time, right now, one of the things that I think is highly concerning is that if you take my picture and you are an ex-girlfriend, ex-wife, there's technology now, artificial intelligence, that allows my picture to be superimposed in a seamless sort of way into a pornographic scene. We see these things constantly, the ways in which these technologies are abused to be incredibly invasive in pornographic sort of ways, revenge porn, and there's just no protection right now. There's isolated protection. And I think as consumers and as citizens, we've never been more vulnerable, and there's never been economic forces that have been swirling deeper and deeper into our lives. And you're conceding the important point, which is that government has a role to protect us. That when we see things that are new and harmful and damaging in the realm of privacy, we set rules and limits. And it seems like once you make that concession, you have to extend it into the present when we see all these new threats.
So the specific concern that you just raised about what new technology can do could have been done with an analog era camera. And indeed, the most famous law review article in American history, written in 1890 by Louis Brandeis and Samuel Warren on the right to privacy, alluded to the danger of Kodak fiends, these monsters who would go out and take pictures in public places using cameras. Well, you know, cameras can cause a great deal of harm. There's no doubt about this. I would never deny it, including invasion of privacy. How have we dealt with that historically? We've dealt with that by narrowing in on that harm and addressing it without saying, we need to regulate all cameras, we need a Federal Camera Act, we need to ban all these things or license them before anybody can use them. No, we said, look, something like a peeping Tom scenario, which is kind of a variant of what you're discussing, is a harm, a legitimate one, hard to remedy. We're going to actually go out and pass statutes that say no peeping Toms. No surreptitious taking of pictures underneath bleachers or things like that or in locker rooms. We have policies that deal with these things right now. We can narrow in on that harm and address the most serious ones without having this sort of overarching regulatory baggage that could decimate the more important types of innovation that happen, not just with cameras, but with all new emerging technologies as well.
Okay. We're going to have some questions from the audience right now.
Does he get to question me, or?
Oh, did you not ask him the question? Go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry,
please.
I was answering.
No, I'm sorry.
That's okay, you can go ahead.
I was trying to
Audience
read
questions, that's
and
fine,
moderate.
in the interest of time.
Please. No, go ahead. Do you want
Oh.
to ask him a question?
Well, let's see. Okay, here's one. So, Franklin, you say in your book, quote, "Our faith in technology is no longer fully consistent with our belief in liberty. We are nearing the moment when we will have to damage one of our revolutions to save the other." Why do you want to place constraints on our liberty, and why would you want to damage the information revolution? Isn't this like burning the village in order to save it?
So just to be clear what I was saying there, which is I'm saying that I think that if we ever have to sacrifice some technological innovation in order to protect liberty, I stand on the side of liberty. And, you know, I look at this world that we're moving into, and one thing that we need to talk about is that to be a citizen in a democracy, you need to be capable of independent thought. You need to exist in a world where you don't feel like there's somebody always looking over your shoulder. When somebody is looking over our shoulder, what do? We start to become cognizant of our audience, and we start to try to bend our views to try to please our audience. That's a natural thing that happens. And so as we move into this digital world where we're being surveilled constantly, where people are always watching us, where life becomes increasingly a performance, I think it becomes more and more difficult to be able to have the space where we're formulating independent views. One thing that really concerns me right now is the effect that Facebook is having on democracy and our deliberative process. We see this constantly, the way in which the technology exists so that it serves us what we want. And it's called, you know, it produces these filter bubbles where when it comes to the consumption of news, instead of being able to read and think for ourselves, it delivers us the news that it thinks that we want based on the data that we've given it. And as a result, it serves us news that taps into, that confirms our biases. It knows the things that give us pleasure and anxiety, and it arrays information in such a way to exploit our human weaknesses. And that makes us worse citizens. And we, you know, right now, it feels like our country is kind of getting torn apart. It's falling apart in a lot of different ways. And I think our best hope is to be able to create the deliberative space, the type of national community that we need, where we can hear one another, talk to one another, really understand one another, as opposed to being served up the type of information that plays to our worst instincts.
Mr. Thayer, response?
Yeah, just very briefly, I mean, these concerns that Franklin's raising, I mean, I just have to come out and just say it. There's just an element of elitism here when we talk about formulating a space for us to find a way to save our democracy and end filter bubbles and get a national community. You know, I've heard arguments like this before. I've heard them in many, many different types of tracks, and always there's this argument that there's some hypothetical, mythical, better age or better place where we could be if only we just listened to the right people about how to get us there, if only we ate our media greens and, you know, consumed the right information and had this national conversation. And we gather, I remember one of the Neil Postman books in the 80s talked about gathering around the right sort of information campfire. I mean, the problem is that these things, I'm not sure how they can exist outside the minds of certain academics who believes that they can sort of guide us to this promised land. The reality is that we all go our own independent ways, and when, yes, we have choices, we don't always make the wise one that some elites in the ivory tower might want, but this is part of human autonomy. This is part of living in a free society and making choices for ourselves. I have no problem with certain people, including Franklin, directing our attention to better options. That's fine. I would try to do the same thing myself if I were still in the world of journalism. But the reality is, you can't always lead people to exactly what you want them to consume. And in a free society, we have to accept some of that, even if it doesn't result in the kind of things that Franklin desires.
Okay, at this point, we're going to shift to
Don't I get a response or no? No.
different type of questions.
I think-
And these are from you, and so what we're going to do is to allow a couple of different ways to deliver those questions. Either come to the microphone, or and I want to try to direct the questions sequentially as much as possible. What we'll do is to allow each person to have a 2-minute response to the question that is asked. So I've got some that are up here that I just pulled, and then, like I say, we'll have some at the microphone. So Mr. Cochran has asked that he ask the first question, so please.
Thank you, sir. And I'm not asking this for myself. I'm asking this on behalf of an alumni, and this is directed towards Mr. Thierer. Do you believe that an equal voice in politics is an important component of democracy? And if so, does it bother you that accumulated wealth increases political voice, such that these large companies have a greater say in politics the more wealth and market share they accumulate?
Well, once again, I'll just have you recall what I discussed earlier about the importance of historical context. Because the reality is that no matter how powerful you think any one particular media platform or operator or outlet is today, they pale in comparison to the power of certain large information intermediaries in the past. The reality is that the idea that any one of these large companies that Franklin's concerned with is steering all of our news and attention and viewpoints is much, much harder to accept than the idea that somehow in the past that wasn't a more serious problem in the age of the William Randolph Hearst and so on and so forth. So I would say, yes, we should be concerned about these things, but we should put them into some sort of perspective and understand that the ways to address them are not necessarily to regulate speech, but instead consider a multiplicity of viewpoints and platforms as the better alternative to speech controls.
So I think that the role of government is to increase multiplicity options. So let's just think about Google for a second. How many people in here use Bing or DuckDuckGo? I didn't think so. Well, two. That's great. That's more than I thought. But most of you use Google to search information. And so the thing that appears first in Google or on the first page of Google is the thing that you're going to naturally be drawn to. And so in this world, the result, Google is the massive new gatekeeper. And so what Google decides is a winner is going to be the thing that you're most likely to look at and will influence your choice. And so it's going to be the thing that the place you decide to go to dinner. And Google exercises enormous control over here. So there used to be this, Yelp used to be the first thing that returned in your Google search results when you were searching for a restaurant, but Google understood that there was a good business to be there, so Google started it, and Google privileged its own position there. And part of the problem with these new gatekeepers is that the way that they operate is completely non-transparent. And so what is Google's logic? To return it to a spiritual example, Google, if you were to search on Google, what is God? That answer, what does Google decide is the first thing that you answer to that question of what is God? But presumably there are a lot of people in the world who are searching, who go seeking, and that's the answer that they come to first, and it has some influence on them. And in the world of politics, this influence can be incredibly invisible, and bias enters into it. I mean, we've seen these debates over Facebook constantly. Is Facebook biased against conservatives? Was Facebook being exploited by Russians? And in this world where you have this enormous concentration of power, where decisions are made in an invisible sort of way, I think we're left to kind of wonder what role these companies are playing in picking the winners and losers, and therefore shaping our behavior.
Okay, Mr. Ford, this next question is for you. You talked a lot about reasonable limits, quote unquote reasonable limits. Considering there are already some limits on companies, what specific limits would you be calling for?
I think that we need to have limits on the data that is collected on us. Right now, when you click on these terms of service agreements, when you want to use these big platforms, which are kind of unavoidable platforms in our life, you can't really be a citizen of the world and not use some of these products. You end up kind of making this all or nothing decision about your privacy. And I, for one, don't read terms of service agreements because I know that there'll be things in them that will annoy me and I'll feel like I have no choice but to click. And so I just unthinkingly click. And I think that it's, you could blame me. You could say that's on me for accepting violations of my privacy. But on the other hand, I feel like as a consumer, I don't have much protection or choice or ability to negotiate with these companies. So I want there to be limits on the type of information that they can collect. If there's something about me that exists, I'll give you an example. There's this Tinder, the dating application. There was a woman who worked with European privacy lawyers to get her data back from Tinder. And what she found horrified her, because every single scrap of information, every single text, every single exchange that she had, every single like on Facebook had been collected. And she got back an 800-page sheaf of information. And she found herself horrified. Now, you could say, well, it's her fault. She shouldn't be there. She shouldn't. But on the other hand, the apps exist. They're designed to kind of induce us to participate. And these things that you think will disappear end up sitting there. And they're used and they're weaponized against you ultimately because they're leveraged in ways to try to keep you engaged on their platform. So when they collect every single scrap of information about you, it's not just sitting on there on the servers, it's being processed and mined in order to try to understand your mind, understand your behavior, in order to keep you engaged for as long as possible on their sites.
Mr. Thier, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll just briefly address the problems with limits on data collection enforced by top-down regulation. If you impose restrictions on the flow of data in a modern economy, you are essentially shutting off the goose that lays the golden egg from delivering more and better services in our modern economy. The reality is if you put up these data restrictions, either one, people will just opt back in after they realize that, well, this is what they've wanted. They go to Tinder, and yeah, there's a lot of sharing. They go to Facebook, yeah, there's a lot of sharing. That's why there's 1.5 billion people on Facebook. This is where they go to share. These are things that you kind of know when you get into the door at these places. Second of all, if you put up data restrictions, then paywalls are going to go up. You are likely going to have to pay more at some point if you're not going to be sharing that information. And I don't know about you, but most people, when asked, would you like to spend $19.95 a month on Facebook, say no. In fact, when studies have been done on this thing, trying to get people to pay as little as a quarter for some of these data things, they say no. They can't even get people to pay a quarter to protect their privacy. This is the so-called privacy paradox. People talk a big game about privacy, but then don't back it up with words, or in this case, money. And third, if those first two things don't already happen, then certainly the service itself will deteriorate or suffer in some other way. It will be limited, or quality will go down, or it will just become non-existent because the sharing will be made illegal or made just very dang difficult. This is the European story that I've already discussed here tonight, which is why you don't have services and platforms in Europe. Europe has succeeded in going to a great extent to protect privacy, but at the expense of losing the homegrown competitors that all flock to America's shores to set up these services that the world obviously demanded, or else, again, you wouldn't have 1 billion plus people on Facebook.
Okay, so Mr. Thier, this is a question for you, and this seems kind of like an interesting question. The moral responsibility of influence. Big tech isn't part of a government system, but aside from government tech, perhaps more power and influence ever seen on an individual's daily life. It concerns news, finance, so forth. What moral responsibility do the tech companies, so I'm assuming, I'll throw it in, quite apart from whatever government regulation might occur, what sort of responsibility do the tech companies have?
Sure. So this is a field that I've done some work in recently, and it's grown out of broader discussions that have gone on for many, many decades about corporate social responsibility. and it's in the tech world sometimes referred to as RRI, or Responsible Research and Innovation. There's a burgeoning field of research around these issues, and a lot of it I find entirely agreeable. And there are a lot of policies that Franklin has recommended that, if not imposed in a sort of top-down way, I might be far more open to. For example, there is a strong movement in the field of data handling to get better data and privacy security standards in the form of privacy by design or security by design, imposed in a sort of best practices kind of voluntary way, or through various types of soft law agreements. What does that mean in practice? It means things like, hey, you should be a good data handler. You collect a lot of data, try minimizing it after a certain period of time. Franklin's right. Maybe these sites don't need it for decades on end. How about just 2 years? How about making sure you encrypt all the data you have? Or making sure that certain types of PII, personal identifiable information, are maybe not collected at all in certain contexts. These are all pretty decent policies. And I would favor many of them applied in certain contexts as part of a corporate social responsibility or a sort of responsible research and innovation kind of mindset. It becomes a very different thing when you start imposing them by law, when you start requiring these things as thou shalt not top-down mother may I mandates. Because that's when you get very quickly into the scenarios I described before, where you have no flexibility and basically prices either go up, service goes down, quality suffers, or you have the flight of companies to other shores, because we live in a world of global innovation arbitrage where if somebody starts to regulate data flows in this fashion, you better believe somebody else will have some sort of a jurisdictional or some sort of a platform where you can go and do it elsewhere.
Mr. Ford, 2
So
minutes.
we keep coming back to this debate about kind of whether, all right, so we both we concede that things need to get better, we need more protections, and the question is, can we count on the market to provide them, or do we need as a community to take responsibility and set rules and standards? Look at what the market is providing us when it comes to the internet. It's a world, the biggest sites are pornographic, conspiracy-minded sites. We get fake news, we get a lot of dreck, and our privacy is empirically, unquestionably being destroyed. Now, Adam is saying, okay, we can accept the consequences of this market. We can accept living in this world of dreck. We can accept these incursions into the privacy because we're getting all of these wonderful things. And I would say, you know what? I would be willing to accept a little bit less of the wonderful things in order to live in a world where we, as human beings, as citizens, set out to protect one another and to set out to protect the most vulnerable. One of the insights in behavioral economics is that people don't necessarily behave as rational actors, that there are times when we are exploited, when we were conned, when we make bad decisions about ourselves because there are these hidden forces that are operating on us, and these tech companies are kind of the masters of the hidden forces. This data is this X-ray of the inside of your mind. They know, they've done so much, they've collected so much, they've analyzed the data so intensely that they know how to exploit consumers. They know the things that give them pleasure, they know the things that cause them anxiety, and they're constantly re-engineering their sites in order to exploit those things so that we stay on their sites longer.
Okay, so let me play with this question from the audience member. Those of us who study politics in the United States know how regulation comes. Congress basically writes a general bill, they hand it over to a bureaucratic agency and the like. And so if the concern is that the market's done a poor job, okay, how about the other guys when they do it? So let me go ahead and ask his question. Is it merely wishful thinking to assume that government regulation and legislation will protect the privacy of citizens when tech giants like Google, Amazon regularly conduct business, sign contracts with intelligence organizations like the CIA, NSA, who've operated beyond the rule of law in the past? So you can take my part of the question, which is, if the problem is that the free market doesn't do a good job with it, how is imposing the government mishmash on it?
Yeah.
And then this specific example.
Totally fair question. I worry about excessive government regulation, but let's go to some of the examples that we know where it works. I mean, we know that government, when it comes to pollution, or it comes to that the government is able to make our water cleaner than it is, our air cleaner than it is. I mean, there are times where government regulation fails, but there's also this massive track record of the times in which it works. It manages to protect us. Our roads are safe, our water is safe, and I don't think that I think when it comes to protecting us, I believe that our government has the ability to do it. I worry about regulatory capture. I worry about the special interests that would end up writing this sort of legislation. And so I think that I don't think we want to have massive regulatory fixes to these problems. I think we want to have targeted regulation that protects our ability to control our own data. I think largely my paradigm would be that I want to have us try to curb the powers of these corporations in order to create space for competition so that when there's I want there to be multiple search engines that are viably competing for my business as opposed to just having the one option of Google, which has us kind of locked in sort of in ways. And I would love it if there were more than 2 people in this room who used a search engine other than Google. It would be great if they were competing in order to provide us with a search engine that protected our privacy. Maybe Adam's right that the market isn't expressing itself, but I also think we need to look at the ways in which these corporations leverage their relationships to government, leverage their the networks that they create, leverage their tax avoidance in order to preclude the type of competition that we would ideally like to see.
Mr. Thayer, response?
So I already addressed the problems with if you try to impose some of these things through the form of federal data collection regulations, so I won't regurgitate all of that. The concerns that Franklin cited about behavioral economics and the fact that humans aren't always rational actors are indeed true, and it should give us great pause because guess what? Humans run governments. And so, yes, there are human errors in consumers, there are human errors in corporate decision makers, and there are human errors in government actors. And that includes not just the potential for things like regulatory capture and special interest influence, it includes the fact that governments do not have crystal balls and make bad decisions or bad bets based upon bad information or limited resources. The fundamental reality of the modern digital age is the so-called pacing problem, the idea that technology evolves exponentially and policy evolves incrementally. And government actors are up against that, as well as limited resources and knowledge, leading to a real serious question about what sort of regulatory system we're going to get in the midst of that problem. I prefer simple general rules, such things like I've already identified, like unfair and deceptive practices, and then very targeted things when all else goes wrong, as I already identified for things like peeping Tom laws and some other areas, narrow areas of privacy. But these grandiose ideas of sort of like overarching privacy bill of rights or broad-based limitations on all data collection and the amorphous talk we're hearing about public interest obligations or fiduciary obligations, it all sounds good until you get down to the devilish details and how these things are enforced and the fact that there, as Milton Friedman once said, there is no such thing as a free lunch, that there are trade-offs associated with all these regulatory decisions, and the costs associated with this could be quite profound. Now again, it could be, and I think this gets down to the heart of a lot of what Franklin and I disagree on, that consumers don't always optimize along the vectors or variables that we might want them to. That includes a lot of the things that I bet Franklin and I sit around and consume on a daily or nightly basis in our own homes, which probably are not consumed by the masses, whether it be the New Yorker or NPR or anything else in between like that. The sort of highbrow fare that a lot of elites want the public to consume. But the reality is that we have to at some point go back to the fact that these are individual choices. And that yes, we can provide more and better information for the public, but we certainly can't be shoving it down their throats through regulation.
Yes, this next question, Mr. Thayer, might be kind of Pollyannish, given the last discussion, but I think it's kind of sophisticated. So it's basically saying, you've already criticized Europe for addressing the problem one way. Would a democratic government do a better job of promoting competition than, say, the European alternative or a centralized communist government? And I'm not implying that Europeans aren't democratic, but so in other words, would the way we do it be different? Does democracy or the American approach protect against corruption and monopolies better than some alternatives in the world? So in other words,
Than
you
the
don't like the
totalitarian
regulation,
countries,
at least the way we do it.
compared to, well, I guess I'd have to ask that person
Yeah.
compared to what? I mean, if we're comparing it to China, then God help us. I mean,
Right.
they've dealt with this and by creating state-run monopolies or by essentially sanctioning companies to do their bidding and become their information henchmen, if you will. I mean, that's obviously not the path.
And he
any of
doesn't
us
mention
want to go
China,
down.
but I think China's the implied
Yeah,
agent
and
in
it
the
certainly
question.
has done a great job in limiting Google and Facebook's reach in China. So, I mean, if the ends justify the means, then yeah, by all means, go that way. But, you know, I don't think that's the way most democratic republics want to go. We can find more reasonable approaches to these issues. And I think that obviously the European model versus the American model, you have to understand that there is a different conception of what really is a societal priority. We have two very different cultures or heritage, sort of constitutional heritages when it comes to things like privacy and speech. We optimize differently in our two cultures on these things. So democratic governments can do things radically different when it comes to information policy. And I will, thank you very much, still side with the Americans why Franklin wants us to go the European route.
Okay.
Well, smear me as the Euro, but that's not me. I'm arguing that the approach that I want to take is the core American foundational way. That I'm standing up here and I'm talking about this thing in the way that Thomas Jefferson would talk about it, because Thomas Jefferson would be frightened about having these massive gatekeepers with massive control over what we see and what we read, and massive control over markets. That this is, and as I've said, this is what Democratic and Republican presidential administrations have done since the beginning of American history, is that they they curb monopoly, they create space for competition, they set reasonable rules of the road to protect consumers. You have a libertarian vision of the world and a libertarian ideal, which is admirable and has exerted enormous, I'm glad that libertarians play a role in checking some of our worst impulses, but I also think that it's an idealized vision that kind of stands outside of the main tradition of American government. That you look at what the Trump administration is doing now with the AT&T Time Warner deal, it's saying, you know what? We're afraid of a concentration of power within the telecommunications business, so we're going to try to block that merger. That's what administrations have been doing since the beginning of this century. And so I don't think that I'm sitting here saying we need to kind of veer off in some sort of foreign direction. I think that the Chinese model is disgusting and antithetical to every single American value. And our value should be to say, you know what? Concentrations of power in this realm of communication are dangerous. And we're not going to sit around dismantling every monopoly, but we're going to try to create space.
Let's ask one more question of each speaker and then go into closing arguments. So Mr. Ford, this one is kind of like the first line of an intro American government text. So why don't you feel free to adapt it to this debate as you wish. Is it the government's job to protect people or to protect freedom and liberty?
I don't think that to protect both. I mean, we do our best. We have a Bill of Rights and a Constitution that protects freedom and liberty, and we have a government that protects people, because sometimes, dead people can't have freedom and liberty. People who are oppressed in various sorts of ways can't have freedom and liberty. And so the government sets out to create checks and balances and curbs in order to protect us as human beings. And I think that, for me, I think that liberty and freedom are fundamental to our democracy, that we think about these things, we can't just think about in the abstract about restraints. This question about the government and the market, I think, can be something that reduces in a lot of ways to cliches, and it gets to be an abstract sort of debate. And I think we have to think about these questions very concretely in our own lives, and about the type of world that we want to live in, and about the type of democracy that we want to live in. And I look around right now and I see a lot that gets better, but then I see these fundamental ways in which our informational ecosystem gets worse. And I look at the ways in which these technologies make our lives better, but I also look at the ways in which they are they're being intrusive, and they're setting up dangerous precedents. And so I think that what we're talking about right now in trying to curb these companies is ultimately really about protecting liberty and therefore democracy.
Mr. Thayer?
Well, it's a tricky question. I mean, I think I'm generally in agreement with Franklin that these things are related. I mean, governments exist to protect the rights of the people and liberties of the people. So these two things go together. Now, how we go about protecting it and what we mean by liberty is where I think we would find some differences between Franklin and myself, because of differing conceptions of what we would regard as the American tradition or heritage of liberty. He is talking a lot about this long-standing concern about concentrations of power and the resistance of our founders in particular to these things. I would agree with that, but just reiterate what I've already pointed out, which that they put extraordinary limits on the powers of governments through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights for the express purpose of controlling those public exercises of power. It doesn't mean that they weren't concerned about private concentrations of power, and certainly Jefferson was. But the reality is that there's only so much that can be read from that to say, like, and therefore Thomas Jefferson would have favored licensing Facebook. You know, I mean, there's like this big assumption or assertion in the room that's unstated that seems to be what Franklin's suggesting, which is that we need to keep with the American tradition and control or curb these media and speech platforms. That is antithetical to what the plain reading of the First Amendment says, at least, as well as to the constitutional fabric, which suggests that we should be extraordinarily cautious about giving individuals with that much power control over media and information platforms.
Okay, so we'll go from a very general question to one that's very specific. An ideologically conservative organization, PragerU, is suing Google, YouTube for censoring educational videos and discriminating against free speech. What role should the government have in speech that is being discriminated against by the tech companies? Yes, to you.
It's an interesting case. It's a case that I've seen suggested before by other parties, including religious broadcasters. Had quite a flare-up with Apple several years ago about Apple taking down an app out of the App Store that they regarded as religious speech, but Apple regarded as hate speech. It involved some views on gay marriage that had concerned some people, Apple consumers and Apple shareholders. And so Apple took it down, and Christian broadcasters actually tried to suggest that maybe there was a First Amendment action that could be taken against Apple to address this app that Apple regarded as hate speech and took down. The reality is, of course, is something you learn pretty early on in civics or in law school about the First Amendment, is obviously it does not apply to private corporations. And Apple, or in the case that we're discussing here with this questioner's question about Prager, is simply not going to probably have good standing against YouTube to suggest that there should be some sort of a First Amendment or free speech concern. Now, if they want to make an anti-competitive conduct assertion, that's somewhat more interesting. But in a world of media multiplicity and so many alternative platforms to which to take your app for religious purposes or whatever else, I have a hard time believing that that case is going to have much merit or fly.
Response?
So I think, so one of the perils, why are they suing? Well, it's because if you're an entity, your financial dependence in many ways rests on your relationship to Google and Facebook. So if Google decides that Prager University is not worthy of being on the front page of Google, when you touch it, type in certain results, it gets downplayed. If you are a media organization, your financial livelihood depends on Facebook and the traffic that Facebook generates. And so I see this in media constantly, that this condition of dependence means that you do everything you can to appease the platforms. If the platforms say, we want more video, you produce more video. If the platform, I saw this as an editor of a magazine, if the platform says, we want more liberal content, more left-leaning content, you actually provide that because you know that your financial livelihood actually depends on it. And that's the real danger here. It's that the monopoly breeds conformism. In an informational ecosystem, if everybody's survival depends on the gods of Facebook and Google, whatever those Google and Facebook say is important becomes the thing that becomes most important to you. And that's the reason that we live in this world of increasing clickbait. And if you look at Facebook, the way in which so much of it is kind of on the surface, kind of trivial, but it's designed to appeal to people based on the things that Facebook has deemed most important because they're the things that keep you on Facebook longer. So you look at those ridiculous cat videos, not because you necessarily want to, but because the data shows that that's the thing that you're going to respond to, and in some ways you kind of can't help yourself there. God help you. Liberate yourselves, people. But you can't liberate yourselves because it's what Facebook and Google provide. You don't have a choice. It's like cat videos all the way. It's hard to escape these systems. And that's the problem of their dominance.
Okay. So we've concluded the multifaceted question portion. We're going to closing arguments now. I'll ask Mr. Foer to take up to 5 minutes for his closing argument, followed by Mr. Thayer.
I just want to circle back to the things that I talked to at the beginning of this, and which is to, when you think about these questions, we've just had this very abstract discussion about law and about economics and about American history. But think about these devices in your own lives. I mean, think about your relationship to your phone. Think about the ways in which you would probably like to have more distance from your phone. Think about the ways in which your phone kind of makes you less present. Think about your consumption of news and the ways in which, when you use Google and Facebook, the ways in which you're being steered, in ways in which you don't necessarily understand, but you kind of instinctually know exist. Think about democratic conversation in your own lives, and think about your interactions with people who are different from you. Think about your own privacy and what you want. Do you want to live in a world where you're being listened to constantly, where you have these discs in your house, or TVs or phones that are constantly mining your conversation for clues about how they can sell things to you next? And I think that when you think about these things, you think about how you can be a better person in your own lives, my instinct is that you'll say that these devices, these platforms, are kind of the enemies of your best aspirations. And I'm not saying that we need to get rid of them. I mean, when you vote on this resolution at the end of the day, here's how I propose that you think about it. I mean, I'm sure I proposed solutions in the course of this debate that you'll disagree with, that you'll find far-reaching. But you're voting really as the status quo versus some improvement. The status quo is that we continue to just kind of drift along this course. So much about American life is kind of, we just kind of, we drift. We just kind of assume that things will get better or that things will work themselves out because they so often do. And oftentimes, we don't stand up. We don't exert ourselves as human beings. We don't take advantage of our own agency to try to make things better. And if you look at this landscape, you look at kind of the informational world that we're with so much fake news and conspiracy, if you look at the internet, which is kind of rife with incredible things, all this access to knowledge and information that allow us to improve ourselves, but also rife with pornography and rife with just triviality and rife with just bad information. The question isn't whether we go back to the Stone Age. The question is, can we do a better job? And I think the answer is clearly yes. And I think even Adam, in the course of this debate, has made concessions. He says that it's true, the government does have a role in protecting privacy, and that we should want to protect privacy. And, you know, you don't have to agree with me and kind of some of my more maximalist solutions, but I do think that if you think that we just need to, we can set some basic rules that, you know, maybe come at some small cost to economic competition, but ultimately improve the quality of our discourse in our lives and protect us against the worst abuses that are out there lurking on the internet, then you should vote yes. Because why wouldn't you want to try to make things a little bit better? And then I return to kind of the thing that I began with, which is that ultimately, these devices are engineered in a way to addict us, and that we're building to this merger with man and machine. And one of the things that I respect most about cultural conservatism, and I think the contribution that Christians can make to this debate, is just that we need to preserve the integrity of the human being, that we need to preserve our capacity to be spiritual human beings. That if we're constantly being manipulated by these invisible forces, if our personal information is being weaponized against us to addict us, then how are we going to have the space in our lives to have those thoughts that connect us to bigger things? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thayer?
So we've heard a lot from Franklin about all of the many dangers associated with our new media environment, but I'll return to where I started, which is that when you put things in some historical perspective, that statement is just not true. But the reality is that things are not worse than ever, things are better than ever. We have more informational choices and platforms at our disposal than ever before in the history of humanity. We also have the ability to give every man, woman, and child the ability to be a personal broadcaster, to stand on a soapbox and to speak to the world in an unparalleled way, to preach whatever it is that they care to preach about, whether it's a religious topic, whether it's a political one, whether it's just something really ridiculous like a cat video. Yes, we have the ability and freedom to do these things now, and I believe the world is better off for it. Also, a lot of the arguments that we've heard Franklin make and other media critics make, or technology critics, come down to what really is an old-fashioned form of sort of false consciousness narrative. The idea that we're all sort of, again, like mindless sheep being led to the slaughter. Consumer manipulation is rife. We can't trust people to their own devices. And by God, if we just give them this more enlightened path, then everything will be better. We can devise a Goldilocks formula of getting things just right, where people will consume just the right kinds of informational inputs to make them better consumers, better citizens, better whatever else. The reality is that these ideas have consequences. These ideas, when put into place in a form of a regulation, supposedly for our own good, rarely serve that end. The reality is that when we talk about the concerns that Franklin has raised, and we talk about curbs on them, which is the term I think I've heard him use at least a dozen times, those curbs usually come down to things like federal licensing regimes, restrictions on speech, public utility regulation, rights of reply doctrine, fairness doctrine, and then more recently things like heavy-handed data restrictions, or even things like the European suggestion of a so-called right to be forgotten. Again, ideas and actions have consequences. The consequences of those things would be we would be embarking on a massive and extraordinarily deleterious regime of information controls that could do great harm to our liberties, not only as consumers, but as speakers and as listeners. We do not want to go down that path because we have seen the results of that path. We have not just a full century, but even longer than that now, of experience with what happens when governments impose well-intentioned controls on media platforms in the name of serving some amorphous public interest. The reality is that it usually then falls to a handful of unelected bureaucrats to tell us what's in our own best good, and then a whole heck of a lot of special interests line up to manipulate that engine of social and economic control. We do not want to follow that same mistaken path we followed before. We have, with the digital revolution, an opportunity to start down a new path. It is already one that is vastly superior to the one we came down, and I would think that if we do small things to improve upon it, but not radical ones, we can make the world the better place that Franklin and all of us want. Thank you.
Thank you.